Okay, we've got more than 10 people.
Wow.
Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome. We're just gonna wait a few minutes, see who turns up. And as I always say, give us a sign if you've been to previous sessions that we've run. If you've been to all 8, this is the 8th and final session. Just check that we're sounding okay. 7 out of 8. Oh, well played, Sarah. I'm not going to ask you what one you didn't go to. But yeah. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, the first one. Okay, well, it's all on YouTube anyway. Great. We'll just wait for a few moments. Oh, you found out afterwards. Okay, that's fair enough. All is forgiven. All is forgiven.
Yeah.
All is forgiven. Oh dear, it's good, it's good, it's good. Final one of the day, final session.
I feel a little bit set up, you know, the last session of the whole thing.
Yeah, but it's the
Might
best.
be a little anticlimactic.
No, the best will last, clearly.
Nah, don't say that. You've had some phenomenal people on.
It's all right, we brought the dream team together.
I'm not trying to set the standard that high. Just lower that right now.
If you're a football fan, you're like the final penalty, and this one has to go in to win the game. So no pressure.
And I used to play defence, so you know.
You weren't the penalty taker then. So you got fans.
The goalkeeper, the one that couldn't do anything.
You got fans. Whitney, you'll be amazing. This is what Sarah's saying. So I don't know if that's a family member, but you know, it'll be fine.
Yeah, send the invoice.
Yeah, no, it's good. Okay, right, we're going to crack on. I don't want to get people going into dinner, supper time, but welcome. This is our final session for our COVID-19 young people isolation conference. This conference has been made possible through the City Bridge Trust. My name is Ben Lindsay. I am CEO of Powder Fight. We empower communities to end youth violence, and one of the ways we do that is by equipping practitioners, anyone who's front-facing with this issue. So this conference is something we definitely wanted to do, and hopefully the 7 previous sessions you found really helpful. If you've missed some, they're on YouTube, or they will be on YouTube by the end of this session. But today you are in for a treat. It is we saved the best till last. Whitney Iles is somebody I've known for a while. She is one of the best practitioners I know. She is one of the most, and I don't really like using the word passionate because it's such a cliche, but actually, if you follow her on Twitter, you will see that she's very passionate about.
Is that what we're calling it here?
That's what we call it. Passion.
Enraged.
Enraged, annoying. No, none of those things. We're gonna stay with passionate. But you know, great experience in this particular area. We're talking about well-being and mental health. So I'm not going to talk for much longer. All I want to say is just, as always, the housekeeping rules are that we will do Q&A at the end. Whitney will be talking for around 40 to 45 minutes. There'll be 15 minutes left at the end where we can have any Q&A. Any questions along the way, please just put in the Q&A box. Don't put in the chat, in the Q&A, because that's just easier for me to just go through them. And any offensive, or it's not even so much language, but behavior or anything which is insensitive, I'll just politely remove you from the session. However, we haven't had that in 7 sessions, and I'm hoping that Whitney doesn't provoke anything in you to then study.
It's going to happen in any session.
Crazy. But yeah, Whitney's somebody I respect and I've got the highest admiration for. So Whitney, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. I will pay you for those kind words later. My name is Whitney. I am the CEO of a small organization called Project 507. We specialize in working with young people affected by violence. We have a trauma-centered approach. It's now called a trauma-informed approach. You know, I have been, well, with Project 507, we do work out in the community, but we also do a lot of work in the prison estate as well. So with young people who are affected by violence, but also perpetrators of violence, and those on the more severe end of that kind of violence spectrum. I have been a practitioner kind of doing this work for, as of this month, the last 18 years. So I've, done a load of different roles. I used to work for charities. I have been kind of self-employed and independent in this for at least the last 13 years. I have training through the Tavistock and Portman Clinic in psychotherapy and, just understanding trauma from a psychoanalytical perspective. I've done recently a master's at SOAS in violence, conflict and development. And I'm currently studying naturopathic nutrition and biomedicine, as well as psychology and neuroscience of mental health at King's. So I think maybe passionate is the right word that Ben used. I love this work. I'm very passionate about this work. I love learning. I love kind of pushing what we know and pushing the boundaries of what we know. Because I think there is, so much more to it, and we should always be students in this work. So I don't really consider myself an expert or specialist in this. Like you, I'm here to learn, and, I'm constantly trying to push myself to know more and expand the work and, adapt the work. I'm seeing lots of chats coming in, so I'm just making sure you can hear me. Oh, study King's too, brilliant. All right, so probably a lot of what I'm going to speak about today, you might have heard in other sessions. I haven't been to all of the sessions, but I have kind of dipped in and out just to be aware of what's going on. So there'll probably be a lot of stuff that we've already covered, but there might be some new stuff in, and hoping that we will kind of bring it all together. I will try to speak for about 40 minutes. I'm normally quite interactive in my workshop, so this is a different way of doing things. I do prefer kind of question and answer and dialogue. We've got a few slides today. Going to be speaking about both young people and young people's well-being and mental health, but also reflecting on us as practitioners as well, because I think, my practice is we have to look after ourselves, and a lot of the work that we do through Project 507 is also work supporting practitioners and training with practitioners and reflective practice and clinical supervision and these kind of things as well. So let me see if this works. Yes, okay. So one of the things that I really wanted to highlight from the beginning, and I'm not seeing this mentioned enough, is that actually, we already know that there is kind of evidence and kind of argument against isolation, and it's, and the kind of effect that it can have on a person's well-being and mental health. But I want to kind of just, before we start with the community aspect of it, really kind of give some time and space to think about those that are kind of in the prison estate and those young people that have been experiencing isolation and segregation in a different form. Because, isolation in schools and within the prison estate is used as a form of punishment. So throughout today and throughout the kind of the session and the next few slides, I just want you to bear in mind that the things that we are talking about also rings true to those young people who are kind of put into segregation in prisons, those that are now kind of in prison, that are in lockdown, that are being locked up for almost 23.5 hours a day. A lot of what we're seeing in COVID is their reality in a normal day to day, which has now kind of been taken above and beyond due to the situation of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, the isolation and segregation is something that a lot of young people and children have been dealing with, and it has been used against them in a form of punishment. So I just wanted to highlight that from, the get-go, because even after lockdown and after the pandemic, there will still be people within our society, especially quite vulnerable children and adolescents, that are being put in segregation. And I think it's important that we highlight that and we hold space for them. So after the pandemic, we can still do work around why we shouldn't be using isolation or segregation as a form of punishment. So I think it's really important to always kind of think about the context and not get too clinical in our language as well, because when we get too clinical, we can kind of miss the point a lot of the time. And what I like to do is really just kind of break things down. So if we think about kind of isolation, especially in relation to young people during the current context of COVID-19, what we can be thinking about is, we know that young people and children, they're not attending school, they won't be attending college and university. And this whole, interaction with education has changed quite dramatically, and it will be online. and different types of children will be able to engage in different ways, again, through context. If you don't have internet at home, if you don't have laptops, your relationship with education is going to be different compared to those that can kind of provide all of that. If you've got parents or carers or adults or older siblings that can support you through the education process. So there's this whole big change in relation to kind of just education and the relationship with education. Unable to see friends and families and those support systems. I do a lot of work supporting youth workers at the moment, and just the whole dynamic with how youth work has changed. Our teams can't go into the prisons at the moment, so we're now 3.5 months into not being able to support a lot of the young people that will be coming back out into the community. There will be a lot of young people in the community, again, that are just not having their regular conversations, those regular support systems, just being able to go to the youth centre, just being able to go and play football and do all the things that they're used to doing. So there's a lot of change, there's a lot of loss in a way. We will be seeing a lot more time on technology and social media. And with this, there's an additional risk. So we've got to think about the fact that, the imagery that's being shown to young people is now going to be tenfold because they have access to social media and technology a lot more. There's going to be more risk in relation to apps such as House Party, where, if you've attended any of the previous sessions, you'd know that, there will be adults and predators essentially kind of masking themselves as children and kind of getting involved in these apps or being able to speak to kind of quite vulnerable young people during this time. But even just the aspect of, if we think about, children that are using technology and social media as a way to kind of self-soothe and as a way to interact with the world, we still don't know a lot about social media and the impact that social media is going to have on children's mental health. This is still research that is happening because it's still so new and there's still so many apps coming and being developed. But just the essence of kind of being on the screen all day and how that might affect the body and the brain. Again, limited time outside, limited time kind of being social and physical activities. Football is a big one at the moment. A lot of the kind of coaches that I support, their children are not out playing football, and football is a very kind of social activity. We've got a decrease in income, so lack of work, whether that's legal or illegal. There would have been a whole kind of change in relation to the economy for a lot of these young people. And then we've got the kind of getting more into the mental health aspects of it, the loss of coping mechanisms. So many of us have developed healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with life. And that might be the football, that might be going to school, that might be being able to go to work or be social or go to yoga or go to the gym. And actually, it being in isolation is we've lost a lot of our coping mechanisms, a lot of the things that kind of get us through the day. Then there will be the kind of general anxiety and fear of potential death or death of a loved one, which all of us will also be experiencing. So overall, we've got a kind of huge feelings of loss, whether that's kind of physical loss, people dying or being able to go out, but also kind of emotional loss as well. This whole loss of normality, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing if things are going to go back to normal, a lot of conversation around the new normal. Now, with other young people and with lots of groups of young people, there will be additionals on that. And a lot of the young people that Project 507 works with and a lot of the organisations that we support are those young people that are kind of at higher risk. And what they might also be experiencing during the COVID pandemic and lockdown is, we have to be thinking about things like domestic violence in the household, abuse and neglect in the home, just having a parent in prison or a loved one in prison. So if your parent is in prison and you're used to going on visits or you're used to having a lot more communication, especially in relation to phone calls, that's going to be a big loss because those that are in the light just went. Those that are in the prison system are not getting access to the phones. There's no access to visits at the moment. So all of those relationships will be broken. So if you've got a child that has a brother, a sister, a cousin, a mum, a dad in the prison estate right now, there will be a real kind of breakdown in that relationship. We're also thinking about, young people that are living in poverty. So we've got a lack of access to food, especially if you're reliant on school lunches, for example, or I know a lot of youth centres that will also be providing food, whether that's kind of just pizza once a week or, however that is, there is there might be a lack of access to food or even good nutrition. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. We also need to think about the young carers, or having a family member who is ill and not getting treatment, and the pressure that that also creates. So we can think about, this is a lot of overwhelming feelings right now. I know many young people that I'm supporting at the moment who have family members with cancer that, again, are not allowed to, aren't able to go into the hospitals to get their treatment, or even young people that are kind of at risk and vulnerable themselves. If we think about stuff like, I support a lot of young people that have sickle cell or sickle cell trait. So again, having to be additionally aware. Also, not to think, if we think about, if there's young people that might have autism or ADHD or other things that might be diagnosed, and how they're coping with the current situation. OCD is a big one right now. If a person already has OCD and has a kind of fear of germs and bacteria, that's going to be tenfold. And also the support that families will be getting around kind of care for loved ones who need additional support, whether that's because of an illness like cancer, or any other kind of reason, or additional support with a child with autism, for example. A lot of that care might not be in place, or might not be in place to the same standard that it was. So again, there's a lot of things that could be going on in the household, and we have to be mindful of this, again, because not all the times we are aware of what young people are experiencing. Sometimes if we get referrals through local authorities, for example, we might have a lot more information. But if we're a youth worker and we're used to working with a young person that's coming into our youth centre, we're very much reliant on what they tell us as well. So there might be a lot of things that they're not telling us. Again, parents or adults in the home with substance misuse issues. And even if we think about the kind of, if lockdown happens, when lockdown happened, what was the drug economy like? That's a very realistic thing. If you've got a parent who uses, and all of a sudden that drug is not available because everyone's kind of in a panic and gone on lockdown, or for whatever other reason, the violence in the household might increase, or we could expect it to increase, or we could expect other things to be happening in the household. And again, with mental health issues, a lot of young people will leave their houses because of what's going on in their house in the first place. A lot of the young people that will come to our youth centres and be engaged in specialist projects are there because there's a lot going on in the household, which is already quite overwhelming. And then we've got the kind of additional stuff of maybe losing a family member or a loved one during lockdown. And that doesn't necessarily have to be because of COVID. The majority of deaths that I've kind of worked around in the last 4 months, very few have actually been COVID related. We've still got homicides happening. We've still got deaths from kind of other reasons, natural causes, car crashes happening all the time. But it also means that grieving process is going to be different, because there isn't funerals happening in the same way. So if a funeral is on Zoom, it's a different type of interaction. So that grieving and that loss, again, is happening in different ways. And then we've got, I hope all those children outside are not too loud, but it's a very natural thing. So I'm just going to leave the window open. Again, history and present lifestyles and how they've been impacted by trauma. We have to remember that a lot of the young people that we're working with are dealing with complex trauma on a day-to-day basis anyway, due to how much kind of community-based violence that they're experiencing, and a lot of murder. Again, murder is still happening. Homicides have still been happening throughout COVID. We might not be aware of them as much because the media has changed, and the media has been focused on the COVID pandemic, and it hasn't been focused on the community-based violence. It doesn't mean that the community-based violence is no longer there. It just means that the spotlight has been on something else. So there's a lot of these issues that will be kind of affecting young people as well as many adults. We've also need to highlight the racial trauma. We've had a lot of very severe videos going around. If we think about the murder of George Floyd and everything around the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of what was going on in social media was a lot of, we're seeing people getting killed at the end of the day. And we're also the experience of everything else around that, the performance activism, the kind of heightened awareness, the arguments, the pushback. There's a lot of overwhelming feelings. There's a lot of being seen. And if we've got a lot of children that are at home on social media, it means that they're seeing this kind of a lot higher rate than they would do if they were at school, or if they would do if they're getting support around it as well. So we have to keep that in mind. Then we have to think about kind of state-based violence as well, and the criminalization of particular groups, and how, you know, how some people feel like, how some people will be getting stopped and searched more than others, and just how that might be internalized, and how so many young people will be feeling unheard during this moment in time, during this pandemic as well. But then also with the additional stuff that's going on, racism isn't new. The Black Lives Matter isn't new. It isn't a moment within itself. It's a movement, and it's something that's been going on. So all of these things are kind of laying on top of each other. So, you know, even, you know, listening to this, hearing this, and, you know, speaking about this is a lot to process. This is a lot to deal with. So if we think about what a young person might be going through in their own home, in their own minds, it can be a very overwhelming, you know, position to be in. Now, what we need to be thinking about in relation to isolation and well-being and mental health is, you know, I'm just going to keep checking my time. Slow me down if I speak too fast, because I'm very aware I can get ahead of myself. So one of the things that I think we need to think about in relation to kind of well-being and mental health and how isolation affects us is we need to be really conscious, especially when we're thinking about young people, is what is the internal narrative being developed, and what is that internal narrative being developed on top of. So if we've got a young person who has experienced trauma in childhood, if we've got a young person that has or is constantly experiencing domestic violence, for example, in the household, or mental health issues within that family unit, they might already feel like they don't belong, or they're not worth love and attention, or they might feel like they're bad, or they you know, most young people already have an internal dialogue of who they are and where their place is in the world. Now, if that internal dialogue is already negative, if that internal dialogue is already one of the world is unsafe, adults can't be trusted, you know, I have to look after myself, then we have to understand that that internal dialogue might then be amplified during this experience. And these are the things that we need to just be very mindful of, is what's going on for that young person, what's going on in their mind, how are they talking to themselves, what is that self-talk, how are they then kind of viewing the world. And a big part of the coping mechanisms and the resilience that will be built and drawn on during this time is how the pandemic is being perceived. Now, there will be many different perceptions of that is in relation to that internal dialogue. Now, if you believe that adults can't be trusted and the world is a dangerous place, then being involved in the middle of a pandemic, you know, it's going to really amplify that voice and say, well, look, I've been telling you that this world is a very dangerous place for me and I don't feel safe. So those feelings of fear and anxiety will increase, because, you know, it's proven a point, you know, saying, yeah, I can't be trusted, or the world can't be trusted, the world is scary, the world is unsafe. It, you know, if you already believe that adults lie and adults are not trustworthy, then you don't necessarily believe that you might not necessarily believe that the government is here to protect you. You know, if you've experienced poverty, if you've experienced racism, if you've experienced structural violence as well, how are you going to then trust the government? So there might be a very kind of internal narrative going on of, I can't trust the government, I don't know what's going on. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of overwhelming feelings. And if you know anything about kind of experiencing trauma with itself is, you know, described as an overwhelming experience that shatters kind of normal coping mechanisms. And this within itself is an overwhelming experience that can really change our coping mechanisms, can really shatter our coping mechanisms. But if that trauma has already been experienced, then there's going to be a lot of change in the way that we relate to the world, and change in the way that we perceive the world. And again, a lack of trust and a lack of wanting to kind of go back out again. So it's very important that we think about, okay, so what is the internal narrative, and what is that internal narrative on top of, and how is this pandemic being perceived by that individual? And then we can think about, okay, is this individual, again, is there already some sense of resilience there, or is there an additional sensitivity? So if you know anything about kind of PTSD, for example, there's a lot more research in relation to PTSD and why some people get PTSD more so than others. And sometimes that can be for the fact that particular aspects of the brain are just more sensitive. A person might have a more sensitive amygdala, which means their fight or flight response may be triggered a lot easier than a person that doesn't have a sensitive amygdala. So if we think about a child that has been through childhood trauma, a child that has kind of experienced community-based violence and had that kind of adverse childhood experiences, we might be thinking about a child that potentially has either worked with the adults around them to contain those experiences and work through those experiences, that then has a kind of a stronger resilience, or potentially we've got a young person that hasn't been able to work through that and has an additional sensitivity. So this experience might put them on hyper alert. So there's a lot of different ways that kind of isolation can really be affecting the mind and the internal dialogue and the internal world that's going on. And on top of this, you know, we have to think about as well the link between the kind of the mind and the brain and the body. And again, this is something a lot of people I see kind of miss out on. And when an individual, just all of us, our whole body, our whole being, our whole kind of livelihood is set up to survival. You know, we've evolved to survive. So everything within our body has kind of got to a place where we can put survival first. So when we start getting fearful, when we start getting anxious, and the amygdala starts to trigger, for example, and this is a very kind of generalization, but actually what we get is a production of adrenaline and a production of cortisol. And what that means is our body is getting ready to kind of fight or flight. And with the trigger of adrenaline, it means that our heart starts to pump and our blood kind of goes into our limbs. And it goes into our limbs because it's getting us ready to actually move, to fight or to kind of run away. And this trigger, it doesn't have to be the kind of physical danger. It can be the kind of the overthinking and the fear of what's going on outside. And this is where kind of anxiety comes from and panic attacks come from, just the body just kind of getting ready to fight, getting ready to flee, getting ready to kind of do something, and the blood really pumping through the system. Now, what people don't, a lot of people might not know in relation to that is when your body is in fight or flight, when your kind of blood is pumping through your heart and through your limbs, it also takes away the blood from the gut. And it means that, you know, food is less likely to digest as well. So what we might also see in relation to isolation is difficulties eating, difficulties digesting food. We might see a lot of kind of, I know, a bunch of young people that I'm supporting at the moment have really bad stomach issues. So there's a lot of kind of gas, there's a lot of bloating, there's a lot of diarrhea. And a lot of people don't realize that these can be interlinked. And also in relation to kind of the gut and the digestive system, that's where 70% of our immune system kind of is. So if we've got a digestive system that isn't kind of working efficiently because we're kind of on high alert all the time, what we might also see is kind of a young person or even an adult just getting a little bit more colds or getting sore throats. And this kind of turns into a bit of a vicious cycle at the moment, because as soon as you get a sore throat or a temperature, you're going to, we might see people thinking, okay, I've got corona, I'm going to be really sick, I might die. And then you panic and you kind of go around and around in circles. But it's important to understand that actually these things are quite kind of intertwined with each other. So kind of through the pandemic and lockdown, what we might have seen with a lot of young people, and please add to this in the discussion in the chat, because I'm not going to say that I know everything about what's been going on. I don't think we've collected nearly enough data. I'm just kind of using my observations and also relating it back to what I know about kind of working with young people that have been kind of isolated in prison, and just drawing on my experience and speaking to a lot of practitioners at the moment. So I think what we've seen throughout the last kind of 3 months is almost phases as well of how this has been internalized. And we would have seen a lot of young people that have kind of gone into themselves, or kind of locked themselves away and kind of gone into lockdown in the beginning and feeling quite kind of fearful. but also feeling quite excited of, I don't have to go to school. It's just like an extended summer holiday. I'm being in your pajamas all day and watching Netflix all night, a lot of changes and a lot of fun. But there might have also been that stage where it's like, well, hang on a minute, what am I doing now? I'm kind of over watching Netflix. I'm overdoing all this. I need a little bit more routine and some kind of changes there, to those that are now wanting to go out, wanting to kind of, be around their friends a lot more, being a little bit more rebellious. Whereas others might have kind of just been isolated the whole time. Everyone's going to cope slightly differently. But what we will be seeing is kind of the development of new coping mechanisms, whether that's kind of using social media, whether that's using food. I think food would have been a big one for all of us. I don't know about you guys, but there was a lot of time to eat and there's a lot of time to have snacks. And when we start snacking because we're nervous, again, or because we're anxious, it can be a lot of sugary foods. A lot of sugary foods might, play into a lot of kind of hyperactive behavior, but also affect the way that we sleep. So when we are just feeling anxious anyway, and we're just having this kind of fear response, we might see a drop in the amount of serotonin that we produce, or a drop in the way we produce dopamine. So we might be doing something else for those dopamine fixes. If you have a decrease in serotonin, you might then have a decrease in melatonin, because they're interlinked. You need serotonin in your body to produce melatonin. If you don't have melatonin, you might then have issues with sleeping at night. But there also might be this kind of rebellion in relation to sleep as well, that we might see with young people as well. So if you were in a household that you don't like and you don't want to be in a way to avoid your parents, a way to avoid your family, is to sleep through the daytime and be awake at nighttime. But then that nighttime might include a lot of self-soothing behaviors, like being on social media all night. So there might be a kind of social media dependency. And then there's also that kind of process of what happens if you're eating all night. If you're eating during the nighttime and sleeping during the day, again, you might find that there are also additional physical health issues that come because of that, which is all going to kind of spiral a little bit. So we have to be very mindful of how these things interchange. So self-soothing behavior like social media, and a social media dependency and a phone dependency, we might see a little bit more of during this time. Risky sexual behavior, sexting, OnlyFans. I know OnlyFans was mentioned previously. It's an app that you can produce sexual content and be paid for. So again, we're thinking about different kind of age groups here as well, but it will still be blended. But actually what we're thinking about is these things can be used as a kind of self-soothing behavior, as coping mechanisms, as a way to kind of get that attention that you might not be getting. And I say that in a kind of more generalized term in relation to attention. I'm not going to say, oh, they're just doing it for attention, but there's actually kind of reasons behind that of, it's about being seen, it's about being heard, it's about being in control of something. But actually, a lot of the response to trauma and the feelings around trauma is you don't feel in control. Violent behavior, and this is a whole other webinar, a lot of violent behavior stems from trauma and stems from a feeling of not being in control. So coping mechanisms and emotional mastery is about how do we kind of create some kind of control over our lives and our being. And this can be done through kind of risky behavior in many different ways or forms. In kind of more general terms, we would see risky behavior, and I would kind of speak about it in training in relation to kind of going into your op block and being able to test what it's like to go into a place which is potentially dangerous, and how that can be done, in the middle of the night, in order to help master those emotions. So what we might also see is additional isolation. So rather than just being in isolation in your house, you might be kind of, I've seen a lot of young people that have kind of additionally isolated themselves to their room. And we see this very similarly in the prison estate as well, as young people just staying in their cells and keeping the doors closed and the curtains closed. And what this creates is a very kind of womb-like space, this kind of very safe space where it's almost a representation of, I can't kind of contain my own emotions in my mind, but actually if I create this physical representation, it will help to contain a lot of these overwhelming feelings that are currently happening in my head. We're seeing a lot of kind of rebellion and rule breaking. Now, the rebellion and the rule breaking, the kind of the going out when you've been told to stay in. Again, we could be seeing stuff like this can be emotional mastery, lack of fear. Again, you know, we see this all the time in relation to, and I was speaking to my clinical supervisor about it previously, this kind of lack of fear. Young people in groups or kind of quote unquote gangs, you know, can be perceived to have a lack of fear, because that group helps to kind of create an armor. So to be able to go out with your friends, to be able to be outside with your friends who, you know, kind of look after you or are there for you, it creates this kind of this feeling of being immortal. So if they're already kind of going out and having this feeling, this kind of armor that the gang provides them, then actually this is another kind of way of coping with a huge kind of state of fear. But there's also this additional part of, if you don't feel part of society, if you don't feel part of your community, if you don't feel kind of part of the state, then, you know, these are not your rules, you know. And this is, we see this in more general life, day to day, you know, these, if I don't feel part of something, I'm not going to obey by my rules, because these rules do not benefit me. I know that the government does not benefit me in a day-to-day basis, so why do I think that these rules are going to benefit me now? So by breaking these rules, it's also kind of you know, given a bit of a fingers up to the state as well. It could also be seen as an act of self-harm, you know, putting yourself in danger. If you know that you are at risk, so you might be highly vulnerable yourself, or, you know, we don't know the kind of full extent of COVID, you know, putting yourself at risk, putting yourself in situations where you then might get ill, you know, it can still be seen as another form of self-harm. And another way of seeing it as well is if you don't like your family, you know, to go out and to kind of have risky behavior and to be kind of going out when we know that we shouldn't be going out, and potentially putting ourselves at risk and then bringing that risk home, again, can be another way of kind of internalizing on a very unconscious level what's going on. And it can be a telltale sign that maybe something is going on in the family settings that we might want to be thinking about, that we might have not picked up on. Again, we might be thinking about anxious and hypervigilant behavior, which we see a lot of the times with young people that have experienced PTSD. And sorry, I was just reading the chat. Kind of anxious and hypervigilant behavior, which is what we tend to see with young people that are experiencing high levels of trauma. And one of the things that I've been thinking about as well is, where does violence come into this, and what's going to happen in relation to violence? And I think, I don't necessarily know if we're going to see an increase in violent behavior, but what we might see is more kind of just outbursts, and outbursts that can be classified as actual, this is mental health issues playing up. So I suspect, and I think we have seen a lot of that across the UK, just kind of quite severe acts of violence. I think, you know, we can start to think about, is this all linked, and how this might kind of play out. I think within the criminal justice system, for example, after lockdown starts to ease, we might then see violence, a kind of spike in violence then, because essentially what we're thinking about is, you know, if you have all these overwhelming feelings that have previously been contained through coping mechanisms that can no longer be contained through those coping mechanisms because they're not there, and then you get put into spaces and rooms which almost act as a physical containment for what's going on emotionally. When you kind of open up that physical containment, a lot of these emotions can kind of just burst out and can just be completely uncontained. And these are the things that we need to start thinking about. How can we start to put in some containment for these young people, and just for society in general, to help manage some of these thoughts and feelings? I hope I'm not going too off on a tangent here. So I think I've got two more things that I just want to mention as well is, so part of this and part of the solution here and part of the thinking is, you know, us as the practitioner we're always a huge tool in relation to how we do this work, and especially around well-being and mental health. Okay, but many of us as practitioners will also be experiencing very many of the same things in relation to kind of, this is the first time we've all been through a kind of a global pandemic. This is new for all of us, and so many of our worlds have changed completely. So we have to take into consideration what us as practitioners are going through, okay? And on top of this, the kind of additional work-related stress and the concern for young people and the kind of helplessness that we feel kind of in doing this work, or we can feel, you know, if you can't be there for your young person in the same way that you want to be, if you can't be active, you know, it's very difficult to be still. You know, we're not in a society that promotes stillness. We're not in a society where it promotes like just sitting with your feelings. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So, you know, this can also result in a lot of crisis-driven work. And in one aspect, that is good because we have to be able to meet the needs of those who are in crisis, but it can also be dangerous as well, because if we're working from a place of anxiety and fear, it can also lead to a lot of mistakes. So that being said, when we start to think about how we help, what are the solutions? How do we work through this in the safest way? I'm really sorry for the really horrific pun here, but it is a case of put your own mask on first, you know. And I was thinking about that in the relation of being on the airplane. I apologize, but it is a case of, you know, put your own mask on first. You have to look after yourself first and foremost. You have to be very conscious of your own well-being and mental health before you can start helping others. In relation to helping ourselves and helping our young people, this is about kind of exploring self-care routines. And I think in some of the previous sessions, self-care was mentioned, and it went into it a little bit deeper. For example, though, breathing. I know, you know, some people use mindfulness and meditation, and some people might think, oh, well, what's that actually doing? But actually, when we think about breathing and deep breath from your diaphragm, what that does is it naturally is a communication system to your brain and to your amygdala to slow down the processes and stop producing adrenaline. And when you stop producing adrenaline because you're breathing so deeply, what it will do, it slows down the actual system and starts to regulate your system on a kind of a biological level and your nervous system. It will slow everything down. So the first thing that we're always looking at in relation to kind of well-being, mental health, and anything related to trauma is we want to start to regulate the body, okay? So breathing is a huge tool in helping to regulate the body. And actually getting a young person to do or any person to do exercise in that process, whether it's going for a run, whether it's doing some burpees in the house, or doing kind of body weight training in the home, using that adrenaline in a positive way, kind of using that adrenaline and getting the system working in the way that it should. If you're having a fight or flight response, actually by either breathing, if you can sit down and breathe, or actually using that energy in the way that energy should be used, is it's the natural thing to do. Kind of use that energy up, use that adrenaline up. Kind of activities, so getting someone out of their own mind and focusing on something. So in the prisons, for example, when a person is in segregation or in isolation, we use puzzles, we use worksheets, we use colouring in books. The mindfulness colouring in books are really, really helpful, because what it does is it's helping to get someone out of their mind and focused on something. And just getting these into kind of habits, you know, daily habits, journaling, writing, kind of colouring in, doing stuff with hands and senses. You know, I use a lot of Rubik's cubes or kind of stress balls, things that are kind of different to touch and different to smell, because actually by engaging the senses, we help the grounding process. So the grounding process, you know, what's in your room? Talk to me about the things that you can see right now. Okay, there's a desk. What color is your desk? What color is your wall? You know, just what can you hear? What can you smell? Engage in the senses in and what's going on in the environment actually kind of grounds and slows down the person as well. We can think about putting language to feelings. And that's a lot of the work that we do in relation to trauma related work and working with a young person to kind of heal trauma and understand trauma, that psychoeducation. And actually, you might feel like this because of, you know, your body's having a fight or flight response, and it's completely normal. Your sleeping patterns changing can be a completely normal thing due to the situation. Talk to me about how that feels. Can you know, what's that articulation? Helping with the, you know, the articulation of what these feelings are. Where do you feel them in the body? Okay. And that's something we can do for ourselves as well. The big thing is working with young people and getting them to know that it's okay to ask for help when help is needed, and building that communication system. Now, sometimes young people won't know, or people in general, and I'm almost finished because I probably know that Ben's sitting there looking at the time. I used to use with a lot of my young people and a lot of the practitioners that I worked with, banana emoji, because the banana emoji was a way to communicate something was wrong without saying, I need help right now. So there's different ways to kind of ask for help without it having to be around language, but it's also important that us as practitioners know when we need to ask for help. And just using, kind of adapting our practices and using reflection as a tool to create flexible boundaries, because in this time we might need to be using social media, we might need to be using our PlayStations and online games to be able to interact with young people, but overall, you know, the primary part of this is healthy relationships heal. So we need to be healthy, and we need to be bringing our healthy self, you know, to the table in order to be able to contain the emotions that a lot of our young people are currently feeling right now, in order to help them process them and work through the pandemic and isolation together. I'm done. I can see Ben.
Wow. Wow. Oh man, that was so rich, so helpful. Thank you so much, Winnie. I just want to open it up to Q&A. I think people have been stunned into silence.
Yeah, I apologize if I made some slips. I like to be very careful about the language that I use, and in these kind of situations where you're just talking, I might have made a few kind of inappropriate slips. I do apologize, but I do take note of all of those.
Totally fine. Yeah, as you can see in the chat, people were saying it was really good. Any questions? Please put in the Q&A. Whitney has, you know, been so, she's covered so much, but if there are any questions or any observations, let's have a look in the chat. What have we got here? So Debbie Roberts, 100% agree. I have been trying to share with others that young people are actually disproportionately impacted by COVID, traineeships going, part-time jobs going, education not the same. But Oli Foundation are now looking at how we can put together scholarships. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I mean, basically, I think, I mean, it'd be interesting just to get your view on this, Whitney. We keep hearing this phrase, the new normal, which is always a bit weird because it's like, it's a bit of an oxymoron. But anyway, I suppose it's a question of, you said it, the landscape has changed. If there were a couple of things that you through your observations, how as practitioners or organisations in the youth sector would need to change in terms of how flexible they need to become in this new normal, is there anything which kind of comes to mind? Because one of the things which, I suppose, yes, there's the COVID situation, but there's this post-George Floyd situation we're living in as well. So I'm just wondering if there's any observations you want to pull, and there's a couple of questions coming in, but while I'm looking at these, anything you mention that?
I think we have to be careful when we start talking about the new normal, because it just thinking about it can be a very overwhelming experience within itself. Like, you know, what is the world going to look like? But with this work, so I work on the more kind of severe end of things. So we're used to dealing with, you know, a lot of trauma, a lot of bad things happening, and in quite intense situations. So our practice has to be very flexible and has to take into consideration how things change very quickly, but also all the overwhelming feelings. Because if you're dealing with trauma, if you're dealing with homicides, if you're dealing with like kind of the severity of things kind of on a day-to-day basis, you have to be very flexible and fluid in the way that you work. So for me, it's always to ensure that we're having the regular clinical supervision or reflective practice, and having that kind of safe space for us as practitioners means that we can be fluid in the way that we work, and we can be responsive to the situations as they're happening. And I think, you know, my biggest thing within this work anyway is, you know, a lot of the young people that I've kind of, you know, my team support, this is their reality anyway. You know, their reality is fear, anxiety, trauma, loss, you know, every single day, huge mental health issues, huge issues with emotional well-being. So we're already equipped to deal with a lot of this stuff. And what we've learned is we have to learn how to work in these gray areas. We're not clinical psychologists. We're not going to work with clinical boundaries. Our boundaries are always going to be a little bit more different and a little bit more fluid. We've had to engage with young people via social media for years, and it's about talking about it, it's about exploring it, but also having that safe space, which is clinical supervision and reflective practice and the right training. But it can be done.
Really helpful. How can we begin to address on a one-to-one level what these young people are facing due to the sheer numbers? I suppose that's a question around, it's not, I suppose prior to COVID, you maybe will be having young people dealing with isolation on an individual level, when now there's a more commonality, I suppose, of some of the issues which young people are dealing with. How do you kind of deal with that mass number who are now making
the thing is with trauma as well, and I had a really interesting conversation with someone earlier this year in relation to the protests in Hong Kong. So before the pandemic even hit, because there was a lot of stuff happening over in China, or China, Hong Kong, just kind of, I think there was a bill that everyone was pushing. So much has happened this year. Do you remember the Australian fires? And actually, when people go through trauma together as a unit, and it's a lot of people going through it as once, because so many people are going through it together, there's a lot of support systems that are going in place, and it's less about kind of, oh, poor me, like this is only happening to me. So in essence, actually, because it is happening to so many people at once, my professional opinion is we don't necessarily have to be the life raft for everyone, because a lot of these young people will just get through it anyway, just because everyone's going through it, and we're all caring for each other as we're doing this. We have to look at what's going on in the community. There's a lot of positivity coming out of this. There's a lot of community care. There's a lot of community outreach. There's a lot of kind of volunteer groups. So when we go through something together as a unit, it's that process of, you don't necessarily feel too alone in the grand scheme of things. What we need to be looking at in this particular situation is who's not coping. Who are the ones that are showing the signs that something is just kind of breaking down internally, that they're having a breakdown. So it's not necessarily we have to kind of be there for everyone. We have to be very careful and very cautious, and be kind of observing who's really going through it and who are the ones that are going to be the most risk. Because going back to the conversations that I was having before, because I was thinking about, what would the trauma look like if, all these protests and everyone being attacked in these protests, but actually what was coming out of what was going on over there was, because everyone was going through it together, there was that unity and that support system, those support, because everyone was going through it. And that's what we tend to see with trauma as well, and traumatic experiences. If there's a lot of people going through it, the resilience is built because there is that understanding, and there are those positive attachments happening. But what I would be looking at kind of right now, and what I tend to look at, is who's going through the internal breakdowns, who's not coping with the situation, and who keeping an eye on those, kind of keeping a more casual eye on the rest of everyone else.
Really helpful. We've got a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of questions. Any tips on reading tools for being aware of the impact of COVID post-lockdown on young people's mental health that you would advise Whitney? If you know anything about Whitney, she's probably one of the most well-read people. I pride myself in reading, but then you see some of the stuff that she I wish she'd get the time. So I'm expecting you to bring out a whole list, bibliography of books, Whitney.
I'm going to do it because my book collection here is here. So I really like this woman, Karen Tradesman, I think her name is. Now, she has actually put up a load of free resources on her website that's all around supporting young people in relation to COVID and isolation. So I would probably go give her a follow on Twitter, and and just kind of go on her website. A lot of psychologists, a lot of psychotherapists are actually putting out a lot of free material right now. So that's really beneficial. Project 507, you can find us on Twitter, literally Project 507. We have a free resource pack as well that has a lot of activities in, and mindfulness, and kind of work out, you know, all these kind of things as well. So there are a lot of resources out there. I just want to go back to the banana moment as well, because I'm seeing a question in the Q&A. So in relation to trauma and overwhelming experiences, part of the, you know, what happens to the brain with in relation to all of this is there's a part of the brain called the Broca's area, which is responsible for translating your thoughts and your feelings into language and communicating how you're feeling. Now, a person that's kind of going through trauma or has experienced trauma may have issues, you know, it may kind of impact their Broca's area. So they may not be able to talk and communicate about what's going on. It's just a kind of a little kind of, there's a gateway that hasn't been met there. So we have to be careful in expecting kind of people to be able to communicate with what they're, you know, what's going on for them. So what I created with a lot of the kind of younger practitioners that I support, or kind of young people, is rather than telling me they need help, because that's a very hard thing to do for most of us, is they just send me the banana icon, or they send me the word banana. As soon as I see that on my phone, even to this day, I will walk out of whatever meeting that I'm in, and I will have a trauma response hat on, and I pick up that phone ready to deal with what's going on at the end of the phone, because that's their signal to me that something is wrong. So sometimes it's not about using words, it's about using symbols, and you can create those symbols with your young people, and it's something that you kind of do together. I did that together with the young professionals that I was supporting.
Really helpful. And then, so it's finally, Natalie has put a question or observation. It was great, thank you. I thought that analogy about the loss of physical containment was really important and helpful, and that an emotional response from young people is understandable. I wondered what ideas you have about how society could do more to provide a better emotional container for young people. Really small question for you to answer.
How much time we got? I mean, there's a lot of systemic changes that need to happen. You know, how do we use score? There's a lot around psychoeducation. There's a lot around kind of just knowledge of self. And, you know, we have to make a lot of structural changes. You know, punishment is something that I kind of question and push back on a lot of the time, because actually a lot of young people that we punish are young people that need help containing what's going on internally. So I think there needs to be a lot of kind of pushback and change and development in the systems that we have created in society, school, education system being a big one of that, and also acknowledging how gender comes into this conversation, how race comes into this conversation, how class comes into this conversation, and the intersectionality between that, you know, Black girls, and how you know, I know Ebby was on previously, so, you know, I know that conversation has already been had, you know, but if we look at everything what's going on, there's always going to be subsections of society that are really, really, really left out of the conversation as well, or really impacted, and we have to start thinking kind of intersectional in the way that we work on kind of every single level. I am going to type this woman's name into the chat.
I was going to say, you might want to type the woman's name in, because a few people missed the last name. Trilsman, was it? Trisman?
And also, if you follow the Project 507 Twitter, or even me on Twitter, we put out a lot of kind of free resources as well. So we do recommended reads, we do TED Talks, we, you know, promote other people's resources just to help upskill people in this area. And
you can follow Power to Fight, and you can see Whitney's Power Talk, which she did for us as well, and various other people. Whitney, thank you so much. I want to say thank you for everybody who has tuned in for all the sessions. All these sessions will be uploaded, if not tonight, definitely by the end of the day tomorrow. So you can catch everything back. If you miss stuff, you can forward them. Power to Fight is a charity, so if you do feel like you have a few coppers in your purse to donate, we can do more things like that, like this. But thank you so much, really do appreciate it. And yeah, Whitney, power to you, mate. Keep going.
Thank you.
Nice one. Thanks a lot, everybody. Speak to you soon. Oh, hold on. Somebody says, I can't see it. You can't see the name. It's up there. Dr. Karen Trisman. Okay. Dr. Karen Tries. There you go. Whitney's done it one more time. And there you go. Alicia is happy. Nice one. Take care, everyone. Speak soon. God bless.
Thank you.